One evening in 1933, Marion Crawford walked into the night nursery at 145 Piccadilly and found the 6-year-old Princess Elizabeth lying in bed with the cords of her dressing gown tied to the bedposts. Not tangled, driving. The cords were reins. An imaginary team of horses waited in the dark. The little girl gave her new governess a long, appraising look, then asked, "Why have you no hair?" Crawford, tall, lean, Scottish, her hair cropped short in the fashion of the time, would later write that from that first moment she had a feeling about Lilibet, that she was special. The child clearly had opinions about Crawford, too. They reached some understanding in that night nursery, and it held for 16 years. When Crawford retired in the late 1940s, she wrote a memoir about those years. It contained the imaginary horses. It contained nursery furniture, bedroom curtains, and princesses quarreling over hat elastics. The royal family severed all contact with her and never spoke to her again. That's the story most people know. The part that changes what the story means came 50 years later, in June 2000, when journalist Vanessa Thorpe reported in The Observer that the Queen Mother had been secretly involved in a government plan to supply the same childhood anecdotes to the same American magazine. Crawford was punished for doing it under her own name. The Queen Mother's involvement, conducted under institutional cover and anonymous by design, was never punished at all. The punishment wasn't about the act. It was about attribution, and attribution is a question of power. Marion Kirk Crawford was born on June 5, 1909, in Gateshead, East Ayrshire, daughter of a mechanical engineer's clerk. She was raised in Dunfermline, Fife, trained in child psychology at Moray House Training College in Edinburgh, and planned to spend her career working with disadvantaged children in Edinburgh's slums. That was the ambition. What happened instead was a holiday tutoring job. Crawford had taken a summer position teaching the daughter of Lady Rose Levison Gower. One day, Lady Rose asked her to meet her sister, the Duchess of York. Nothing was said at the time. A fortnight later came the offer. Would Miss Crawford like to be governess to the two young princesses? She went for a trial month, to see if you like us and we like you, and stayed for the rest of her working life. She was 24 years old. The family she joined in 1933 wasn't yet the family the world would come to know. Albert, Duke of York, second son of George V, had not expected to be king. Elizabeth was 6, Margaret 2. They lived at 145 Piccadilly, a tall, narrow house near Hyde Park Corner, in a household of moderate royal grandeur rather than full palace ceremony. Crawford's role was formally that of governess, responsible for the princess's education in history, literature, language, and music. But from early on, she worked to give them something the palace didn't naturally provide: contact with ordinary life. She took them on the London Underground. She took them shopping at Woolworths. Public swimming pools, park walks, cups of tea at the YWCA. Crawford created the conditions for the princesses to move through the world as something close to normal people, at least briefly. She organized a girl guide pack inside Buckingham Palace, specifically so Elizabeth and Margaret could meet other children their own age in a relatively unguarded setting. Then, in December 1936, everything shifted. Edward VIII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. Albert became George VI. The family moved to Buckingham Palace. 10-year-old Elizabeth became heir presumptive to the throne. Crawford moved with them, and her role expanded. She was now helping to prepare a future queen for a role no one had expected her to fill this soon. She stayed through the coronation in 1937, through the opening of the war in 1939, through bomb shelter nights at Windsor Castle, while the Luftwaffe worked through London. She stayed through Elizabeth's teenage years and into her early adulthood, through the courtship with Philip Mountbatten, which she observed closely and later wrote about in detail. Crawford had a long-term relationship of her own with a man named George Boothly, but postponed their marriage for 16 years because leaving the household had never felt like the right moment. She finally married Boothway in 1947, 2 months before Princess Elizabeth married Philip. Shortly afterward, she retired. For that service, Crawford received several things. She received a Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, a personal honor from the sovereign. She received a pension. She received a grace and favor residence in the grounds of Kensington Palace. Nottingham Cottage was small, 1,324 square feet, designed by Christopher Wren, set among the gardens of the Kensington Palace complex. Queen Mary, the princess's grandmother, furnished it personally with Victorian furniture and prints of flowers as a mark of appreciation for Crawford's years of service. Crawford described it as a dream of seasoned red brick with roses round the door. She wrote, "I had never before had a home of my own, and to me it seemed wonderful." She had given her 30s to the royal household. Now, in her early 40s, she had a husband, a cottage, a pension, and what seemed like a quiet retirement. That lasted roughly 2 years. In 1949, Bruce and Beatrice Gould, editors of Ladies' Home Journal, a large circulation American magazine, approached Buckingham Palace about publishing stories on the royal family. The palace declined. The British Foreign Office didn't. Anglo-American relations were a priority in the post-war settlement, and feel-good material about the royal family played well in the American market. The Foreign Office suggested Marion Crawford as a source. She was the recently retired governess of the future queen. She knew the material. She was willing. Queen Elizabeth, Crawford's former employer, soon to be known as Queen Mother, heard about the arrangement and wrote to Crawford on April 4, 1949. The letter is clear and unambiguous. "I do feel most definitely that you shouldn't write and sign articles about the children, as people in positions of confidence with us must be utterly oyster." Then came another point, less frequently noted. The letter referenced a Times journalist named Dermot Mora, who had been engaged to write the articles based on information Crawford could supply. Crawford could help him with his articles and get paid from America, the Queen wrote, as long as your name didn't come into it. Anonymous contribution, in service of the arrangement already in motion, with payment, permitted. Signed publication under Crawford's own name, the line not to cross. Crawford's husband, George Boothway, signed a contract on her behalf with the Goulds. The contract stipulated that publication could proceed, possibly without royal consent, under Crawford's own name. Crawford and Boothway were paid $85,000 for the American magazine pieces. The UK serialization rights, purchased by Woman's Own, went for £30,000. When Lady Astor sent a copy of the manuscript to Queen Elizabeth in October 1949, the response was immediate. She told American publishers that, "The Governess has gone off her head." She had her private secretary write to Lady Astor, listing passages of particular concern. Specifically, Crawford's account of the royal family watching London burn from Brunswick Tower during the Blitz, which the Queen found inaccurate and alarming. The Goulds considered the manuscript sympathetic, kept the palace's response from Crawford, made some adjustments, and published anyway. The Little Princesses appeared in 1950, published by Cassell in London and Harcourt Brace in New York. At 314 pages with photographic plates, it was a substantial book. Time magazine described it as gossipy but quite innocuous. Tatler called it a harmless memoir. Jane Ridley, the biographer, who later read it while researching the late Queen's life, called it a gem, essential reading for anyone interested in the royal family in the 20th century. The contents bore out those assessments. Crawford wrote about Elizabeth and Margaret quarreling over hat elastics. Elizabeth apparently had a decent left hook, and on at least one occasion, Crawford was shown a hand bearing what she described as royal teeth marks from Margaret. She described both girls' nail-biting habits and Margaret's tendency to bite her sister. She gave detailed accounts of their bedrooms. Elizabeth's in pink and fawn, with flowered chintz and plain white furniture. Margaret's in salmon pink and more cluttered. She included an observation about palace life that read, "Life in a palace rather resembles camping in a museum. These historic places are so old, so tied up with tradition, that they are mostly dropping to bits." There was more pointed material elsewhere in the book. Crawford wrote about George VI's emotional reserve, noting that he wasn't a demonstrative man, and Lilibet took after him. She described the royal family's doubts about Philip's suitability as a match for Elizabeth, the sense among some advisers that he was a prince without a home or kingdom. She ventured into speculation about whether the king and queen had been disappointed not to have a son. These passages were more sensitive than the bedroom descriptions, and they involved living people. By the standards of 1950, some of it was genuinely pointed, but by the standards of what would come later, and by the standards that any reasonable reader applies, the book was what its contemporary reviewers said it was: affectionate, domestic, fundamentally sympathetic to the family it described. The word mild isn't a stretch. It's the accurate characterization of what Crawford actually wrote. The family's position was that the content wasn't the issue. The issue was the principle. A trusted confidant had sold private life under her own name, in defiance of an explicit written warning, to commercial publishers for $85,000. The Queen Mother had an argument. She wasn't entirely wrong about what Crawford had done. What she did in response is what requires examination. The erasure was immediate and total. George VI and Queen Elizabeth cut off all contact with Marion Crawford as soon as the publication became clear. Neither princess spoke to her again. Time magazine described her as having left ostracized and brought to the edge of a nervous breakdown. The magazine's precise phrase for her new status within the royal circle: a non-person. Nottingham Cottage, given to her on retirement, furnished by Queen Mary with flowers and Victorian furniture, described by Crawford as the first home she'd ever had, was withdrawn. She vacated it in the autumn of 1950. No written eviction order has surfaced in the published record. Grace and favor arrangements worked differently. She simply lost the right to remain. She left. The punishment was conducted entirely through private social mechanisms. No public statement from Buckingham Palace condemned her. No legal action was pursued. The palace didn't need either. The withdrawal of warmth, housing, and access, the erasure from the circle, was sufficient. Inside the royal household, Crawford's name became a technical term. Staff who revealed information about their employers or who sold stories to the press were said to be doing a Crawfie. The phrase persists in accounts of royal service decades later. It appears in guides to palace culture, in histories of royal service, in journalism about every subsequent wave of royal memoirs. Crawford didn't just lose her connection to the family. She became the cautionary example. Her name became the warning. Even within royal circles, the consensus that eventually formed was that the punishment had been disproportionate. The Orion edition of The Little Princesses, published in 2002, noted that most people who had examined the case closely believed Crawford's punishment had outweighed her sin, and that the primary architect of the response had been the Queen Mother. The Observer's characterization of the Queen Mother, based on documents that emerged in 2000, was ruthless and unforgiving. None of this came with any public accountability from the palace itself. Crawford moved to Aberdeen in late 1950, buying a substantial house on Rubislaw Den South with the memoir proceeds. Over the following years, she relocated to a smaller house on North Deeside Road, the route the royal family used when traveling to Balmoral. Multiple independent accounts describe her standing outside when the royal motorcade passed. The cars never stopped. She continued writing, or at least lending her name to writing. Books about Queen Mary in 1951, about Queen Elizabeth II in 1952, about Princess Margaret in 1953. None restored favor. None prompted contact. The woman's own column arrangement had been running under the name Crawford's Column, a social diary written in advance by journalists, placed in upcoming issues regardless of events. In June 1955, the column described the Trooping the Color ceremony and royal ascot as proceeding normally. Both had been cancelled that year because of a national railway strike. The pre-written column ran anyway. The public understood immediately that Crawford couldn't have been present at events that had not taken place, that the column had never been written by her at all. The arrangement collapsed publicly. It was another layer of reputational damage, this one self-inflicted. George Buthley died in 1977. Multiple independent sources describe what followed as a serious depression. Crawford attempted suicide. She left a note that read, "The world has passed me by, and I can't bear those I love to pass me by on the road." She survived. She continued to live in Aberdeen. Among her most treasured possessions, kept with conspicuous care, were Christmas cards from an earlier period. Hand-drawn cards from Princess Elizabeth, signed, "To Crawford from Lilibet," written before everything had changed. Marion Crawford died on February 11, 1988, at Hawkhill House Nursing Home in Aberdeen. She was 78 years old. At the time of her death, Queen Elizabeth II had been on the throne for 36 years. The Queen Mother was 87. Princess Margaret was 57. No member of the royal family attended the funeral. Neither the Queen Mother, nor Princess Margaret sent a wreath or flowers. Crawford had left instructions with her solicitor, Bruce Russell, that a box of letters, documents, and keepsakes should be held until certain conditions were met, until they could no longer harm those they concerned. The Christmas cards and royal mementos were transferred to the royal archives after her death. The other documents, the letters, the legal papers, Russell kept longer, considerably longer. On June 25, 2000, The Observer published a piece by journalist Vanessa Thorpe under the headline, "Queen Mother was ruthless to royal nanny." The article was based on research conducted for a Channel 4 documentary, research that had surfaced the private letters and legal papers still held by Crawford's solicitor, to be released after the Queen Mother's death. The documents included the Queen Mother's utterly oyster letter of April 1949, never previously published in full. But they showed something else. Something that reframed the entire story. The article reported that the Queen Mother had been secretly involved in a government plan to sell anecdotes about her daughter's childhood to an American magazine. The deal had been brokered with the palace by the Foreign Office, in the belief that positive material about the royal family would benefit Anglo-American relations. The same magazine, the same childhood anecdotes, the same general exercise in making private family material transatlantically useful. To understand precisely what this means, the utterly oyster letter has to be read with this context alongside it. The Queen Mother's objection, as stated in her own words, was specific. Crawford shouldn't write and sign articles about the children. Not that the material shouldn't be used, not that the anecdotes shouldn't reach American readers, only that Crawford's name shouldn't be attached. The same letter explicitly sanctioned Crawford contributing to a journalist's articles and receiving American payment, as long as your name didn't come into it. The Queen Mother's involvement in the Foreign Office plan followed the same logic. Anecdotes about the childhood of Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, provided to an American publication, in the service of Anglo-American relations, fine. Done under institutional cover, without attribution to the Queen Mother herself, also fine. What wasn't fine was Crawford's name appearing on the byline of a signed commercial account. Crawford's close friend and confidant Nigel Astle, speaking to The Observer, said, "She always hoped for a reconciliation, but it never came. Crawford was intensely loyal and wouldn't use the letters to defend herself, even though they showed she had been acting in good faith." For roughly 30 years after the memoir's publication, Crawford protected the Queen Mother by keeping those documents private. During those 30 years, she was publicly described as a traitor, a betrayer, a woman who had broken a sacred trust. She attempted suicide. She watched royal cars drive past her window without stopping. She died in a nursing home in Aberdeen without a single royal wreath. The documents, when they finally emerged, showed that the Queen Mother had participated in structuring the very arrangement that Crawford was then punished for. The distinction between their two positions was this: the Queen Mother had ensured her own involvement was anonymous and deniable. Crawford had not. That was the crime, not the disclosure, not the anecdotes, not the affection or the domestic detail or the imaginary horses, the signature. There are counter-arguments worth acknowledging, because intellectual honesty requires them. Crawford had a written warning. The letter from April 1949 is clear. She published under her own name anyway, against explicit instruction, through a contract her husband signed that was designed to allow publication without royal approval. Her punishment was disproportionate, but it wasn't unprovoked. The memoir also contained more than nursery anecdotes. The observations about the king's emotional reserve, the doubts about Philip's suitability, the speculation about a missing male heir were more pointed than the hat-elastic disputes. Not explosives, but disclosures about living people, from someone who had been granted access that was never meant to generate a commercial book. And the Queen Mother's involvement in the Foreign Office plan isn't identical to what Crawford did. One was a government-sanctioned, anonymously executed PR operation conducted on behalf of post-war Anglo-American relations. The other was a signed commercial memoir published internationally. The moral parallel is real. The acts aren't the same, but they share the essential element: private knowledge about the childhood of two princesses deployed for strategic purposes by people who had been entrusted with that knowledge. Crawford did it openly, for money, under her own name. The Queen Mother reportedly did it covertly, through institutional channels, with deniability intact. Both involved the same material, the same magazine, the same audience. The difference was attribution. And attribution in this world was everything. The phrase, doing a Crawfie, encodes a specific logic. Named disclosure is betrayal. It's exactly the logic the Queen Mother applied in drawing the line between anonymous contribution and signed authorship. The system criminalized attribution. It didn't criminalize disclosure. This is what made Crawford's punishment not a matter of principle, but a matter of power. The principle, that the family's private life should remain private, was selectively applied. What was actually enforced was something narrower and more strategic: control over who got to put their name to the story. Crawford wrote about nurseries and nicknames and a childhood most people would call sweet. That was enough to end her life inside the family, permanently. What wasn't enough, apparently, was actually doing the thing she was punished for, as long as you did it quietly and nobody could prove it was you. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe.